Hello and welcome to Tov News channel. Qatar, a small Middle Eastern nation that casts a huge shadow relative to its size and its population, a country that sits on stockpiles of natural gas and steers regional and international affairs through spending lots of cash in return for influence. And all this while promoting Islamist and jihadi ideology. With us, straight from Mexico, Dr. Francesco Gil-White. Hello, Francesco.
Hi, nice to meet you, Alex. Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. And so before we start, we will tell you that we are Tov News. We are an independent Jewish news channel. We express our own views here, very special points of views, and you get to manage us through your contribution. Under the video player you can find different methods to contribute to us and to support us. Also, please like, subscribe and share this video. And Dr. Gil-White, so we have a new administration in the US, the Trump 2.0 administration, and there are all kinds of rumors in Israel lately about certain connections and ties between this new administration and Qatar, the terror sponsor state. And I understand that you have done some research and taken a lot of interest in this issue. So please share with us your thoughts.
Yes, well, I'm mostly interested in being able to reason logically from the facts of the relationship that the U.S. bosses have, you know, the people running the United States, with the Emirate of Qatar. I don't think we need any new tidbits of special relationships between people in the Trump administration and Qatar, because there's been a relationship of long standing between U.S. bosses and Qatar. So nothing's changed. So if you tell me there's a special relationship between Trump and Qatar, I would come back and say, well, sure, but there was a special relationship between Biden and Qatar, between Obama and Qatar, Clinton and Qatar, and so forth. So I think this is a strategic issue. It's not a personal issue with Trump. Look, Qatar is the host of the largest U.S. military base, the most important U.S. military base in the entire region. It's the headquarters of CENTCOM, Central Command, and the area of responsibility of CENTCOM is North Africa, the Middle East, and Central Asia. It's a gigantic, very important military base and headquarters, and it's in Qatar, which means that the U.S. has had for a long time an intimate strategic relationship with Qatar. Now, what should we conclude from this? I think the first thing we need to look at is how dramatically Qatar needs the United States. Qatar cannot exist without the United States base. Why? Because as you mentioned, it has gigantic gas reserves. In fact, I think it's the largest gas reserves in the world.
Yes.
So
correct.
Obviously Qatar is very attractive to any imperial power that wants to get a hold of those gas reserves. And therefore, Qatar cannot exist as an independent state unless it has a U.S. base there, because it's a tiny little peninsula of sand. It's entirely flat. It cannot be, it's the size of Connecticut. It cannot be defended. So what this means is that if the United States, the protector of Qatar, would like to change Qatar's foreign policy, it could do so in a second. And therefore, the fact that Qatar's foreign policy, as you just mentioned, is to finance the growth of jihadi terrorism around the world, and in particular, jihadi terrorism directed against the state of Israel, well, then that's U.S. policy. Because the U.S. bosses could change Qatari policy in a second. In a second. All they have to do is say, look, if you don't do X or Y, we will leave Qatar. We will put everything in Saudi Arabia, or we will put everything in Israel, or we will put everything somewhere else. the threat of leaving would be enough to make Qatar change its foreign policy. The demonstration is that when Joe Biden told the Qataris that they had to expel Hamas leaders, which happened just a few weeks ago for the first time, Qatar was like, okay. And the only reason that happened is that it had become too embarrassing that the Hamas leaders were all living in Qatar. You know, it just became too embarrassing. So Biden told them, you know, you have to kick them out, which they did. But Biden could have told them, you have to stop financing Hamas. He could have told them, you need to force Hamas to return the hostages, or any of a million things that the U.S. bosses could have made Qatar do, and they don't do it. Trump didn't do it in his first, in Trump 1.0, right? His first administration. He didn't do that. He didn't force Qatar to change its pro-jihadi policy, and he's not going to do it now. So nothing has changed, and it's not a Trump personality issue. It's not a personal idiosyncrasy. This is U.S. policy, and what it suggests is that, at least in this dimension, Trump is exactly the same as Biden.
So after we've explored the Qatari part of the equation, what's in it for Qatar, we will have now a quick word from our sponsor, and then we will explore the other side of the equation. So please, a quick word from our sponsor.
כמה הייתם מוכנים לשלם על מנת שתתפרק עד היסוד אג'נדת הפרוגרס והפקידות?
כל זה עומד על הרעיון שאין טוב ורע, יש חזק וחלש. ואתה תמיד צריך להתייצב לצידו של החלש.
2024 מהפכה. התקשורת העצמאית, האנטי-ממסדית, משנה סדרי עולם.
You know you're a fake. Your whole network, the way you cover it, is fake. That's why nobody trusts the media anymore.
היום אני קוראת כותרת ואני מבינה מה האינטרס מאחורי הכותרת, מה הכותרת באה לעשות, מה לעשות לי, לאן היא מכוונת אותי ומי כנראה היוזם שלה בכלל.
בדיוק כמו בארצות הברית, התקשורת בישראל מוטה שמאלה עם תקציב עצום של מעל 5 מיליארד שקל בשנה, והיא מנסה לסתום לנו את הפה.
לא יודע אם אתם שמעתם על ערוץ טוב, אבל באמת לעומתו ערוץ 14 זה פילוני.
ערוץ טוב ממשיך להביא את הבשורה, אבל בלעדיכם אי אפשר יהיה לנצח במהפכה הזאת. תנו לנו את הכוח ותמכו בנו כדי שנוכל להמשיך ולייצר עיתונות עצמאית, יהודית ולאומית. בכל אפשרויות התמיכה, ייכנסו לקישור מתחת לנגן.
אנחנו מבינים שבחינם אז אין חינם בעולם. אז כנראה שיצטרך להיות תשלום סמלי מסוים רק בשביל לקבל משהו אמיתי.
We are back in Tov News channel with Dr. Francesco Gil-White, and we were discussing Qatar. So to wrap up the first part of our discussion, we understand that the Qatari interests are mainly rooted in protection, which stems both from the topography of the country, which we discussed, and also I will add from the demographic conclusion of the country. I mean, there are, I think, almost 2.5 million people living in Qatar, but only 300,000 of them are citizens. So there isn't much population there to protect itself. I mean, and to serve in military forces, and naturally it would need outside protection. Now, we also spoke about the natural gas reserves of Qatar. The US, with Donald Trump in power now, is supposed to unleash its energetic potential. So this natural gas reserve, I don't think it's very significant for the US. So the question that rises is, what's in it for the US?
Well, clearly, what's in it for the U.S. is whatever Qatar is doing. If the United States does not change Qatari policy, that means it's happy with Qatari policy. And I think that if we look more broadly at the policy of the U.S. bosses, we see a very consistent picture. I could tell you a very long list, but I'll keep it short. Before the Hamas attack of October 7th, 2023, 6 months before, the U.S. released $6 billion for Iran. For Iran, who is also a sponsor of Hamas and other terrorist groups that are dedicated to the genocidal destruction of the Jewish state. the US freed $6 billion for Iran. And after the Israeli operation in Gaza began, they announced $100 million for Hamas. Of course, they said it was, humanitarian aid, but nobody's going to receive that is not Hamas. So it's for Hamas. That's consistent with the Qatari policy. That's in perfect alignment with Qatari policy. Or I could mention the several $billion, I think something like almost $3 billion a year that Egypt gets because of the peace agreement, so-called, signed in 1979, right, with Israel. So the U.S. has been rewarding Egypt for signing a piece of paper, a peace agreement that Egypt would never intended to keep. As we now know, it has been violating the agreement because in the Philadelphia corridor, once Israel controlled it, they found more than 150 tunnels there that Egypt was using to support Hamas. So all of the money that is going to Egypt, which Egypt spends on armament that is coming from the United States, well, that's obviously consistent with the pro-Qatari policy. How about the money that the United States sends to Lebanon, to the Lebanese military? They've been spending billions of dollars on the Lebanese military since 2003. The Lebanese military is an appendage of Hezbollah. Everybody who looks at Lebanon for the last couple of decades knows that. The greatest recipient of U.S. weapons in the entire world is Saudi Arabia, a mortal enemy of Israel that has been a major financier of terrorist anti-Semitic movements. If you go back in history, you'll find the amazing scandal, Iran-Contra, in the 1980s, when Ronald Reagan was discovered, Reagan and Bush Sr. were discovered to be sending billions of dollars in armament to Ayatollah Khomeini, the founder of the Iranian world jihad, the guy who promises to exterminate the Israeli Jews, the regime that promises every month that they're going to commit genocide in Israel. They were sending billions of dollars in weapons year after year during the 1980s in secret to the Iranians. I could go on. The list is very long, but the most important item in that list is the Oslo so-called peace process, because the Oslo process brought PLO Fatah inside the Jewish state. It gave strategic militarily strategic territory to PLO Fatah. And PLO Fatah, though people don't know this anymore, is the creator of Iran. It was PLO Fatah that armed and trained Ayatollah Khomeini's guerrillas that fought the Iranian Islamic Revolution. They trained them in Lebanon, in training camps in Lebanon during the 1970s. This was on the front page of the New York Times in 1979 when the Iranian Islamic Revolution happened. So it's not as if the CIA doesn't know this. Ordinary people don't know this because it has disappeared from the news and from academic papers, but it was reported on the front page of the New York Times in 1979. And of course the CIA knows this. So when they invented the Oslo process to bring Iran's daddy, PLO Fatah, into militarily strategic territory of the Jewish state, they knew exactly what they were doing. And once again, it's completely consistent with everything else that the US bosses are doing. Clearly, their policy is to destroy Israel.
Well, exactly, and not only that, regarding the Islamic Revolution, there's also ample evidence of actual Palestinian terrorists aiding the revolution in Tehran in 1979, actively fighting alongside the Islamist regime. And but up until now, we were only discussing results. I mean, the results and the consistency of the American policy along the years proves that it is in U.S. interests to promote this so-called alliance with Qatar.
No, I disagree. I don't think it's in the interest of the United States, because the United States is...
Correct. Let me correct myself. Not the United States interests. Certain actors within the U.S. system.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this is my next question. What are the interests that drive this policy? Is it the industrial military complex? Is it a continuation of maybe the Obama regional integration policy? What's the interest behind this?
No, I think the interest is primarily political. So you have to think of this in terms of freedom and slavery. So Qatar is I think, perhaps the most extreme slave state that now exists. So according to a recent article by the New York Times, 94% of the economically active population in Qatar are foreigners. You were mentioning this earlier. Most of those foreigners are slaves. I'm not saying that as a metaphor. I'm saying that literally. So these are people who are brought to Qatar with false promises of employment, or else they're kidnapped in different countries, many from the Philippines, from India, from other places. And once they're in Qatar, they take their passports away, so they cannot leave. And they become prisoners. They become literal slaves in Qatar. Their employers pay them when they want to. When they don't, they don't. They are physically abused. Some of them are sexually abused. There's a lot of sexual slavery in Qatar. And these people have no protection of human rights or labor rights or anything like that. And whenever their employers don't feel like they need them anymore, they just throw them in the street, and they starve to death. This is the situation in Qatar. We're talking, there's something like 2 million slaves or something like that. So it's a slave state. Now, what is Israel? Israel is the state founded by the Jewish people as a Jewish state, and the Jewish people are the people that they're the social and political movement that was founded on the story of a slave revolt. Okay, so the law of Moses, which is promulgated in the Torah, is a body of law that the Israelites received after they staged a slave revolt against their owner, against their master, the Egyptian Pharaoh. And therefore, Jewish law is exquisitely designed to fight oppression and to abolish slavery. So when you, and this has been going on ever since the Jewish people began making waves in history. The bosses who want to enslave everybody understood that they had to get rid of the Jews first if they wanted to enslave everybody else, and if they wanted to do it permanently, because otherwise the example of Jewish life and the example of Jewish thought was, of course, going to influence all those slaves to fight for freedom. And that, in fact, has been going on throughout the history of the West. Jewish ideas have inspired Christians, and the Judeo-Christian ethic and evolution of thought is what led Western civilization to produce modern democracy, because modern democracy is founded on the principle that we are all equal under the law because we are all equally the children of God. That's a principle that comes from the Judeo-Christian tradition and not from the Greco-Roman tradition, which was making slaves. Okay, the Greco-Romans had hundreds of thousands of slaves, millions of slaves. So what is going on right now, what the US bosses are doing, is they are assisting the jihadi movement, because the jihadi movement, well, first, because they want to extinguish freedom. They're pro-slavery, and the jihadi movement is the greatest force in the world right now that is trying to enslave everybody. And so, of course, the jihadis, like other oppressors before them, like the Nazis, like the Russian czarists, like the Catholic Inquisition, or the ancient Greco-Roman and Greco-Macedonian emperors, the jihadis want to do the same thing. They want to exterminate the Jews because they understand that a world of slavery is not safe if the Jews still exist, because the Jews have taught us to fight oppression, to fight for our liberty. So this is what's going on. It needs to be understood in the context of the fight between slavery and freedom. And of course, fighting for freedom today, as always, means fighting with the people of Israel, with the Jewish people.
Yes, so the concept of slavery versus liberty fits perfectly well also with the known alliance between jihadis and globalists, which as well are pro-slave society and against liberty. And it also fits quite well with the notion that the Jewish people is the most persecuted one in the world history. This makes perfect sense since the Jews invented liberty, the concept. But now we have a new administration in the White House, and lots of policy changes are coming. And one of the declared policy changes will be a reform, a massive reform in American colleges, which are known to be heavily funded by Qatari money during the recent decades. How will this collision of interests will sort out?
So the way I interpret that, so you need to interpret everything in a global context. So on the one hand, as you say, there is a push to force woke into retreat. Okay, so that's going on, and part of that is what you say. The reforms that are now being pushed on universities, especially elite universities, which have been indoctrinating their students into anti-Israel, an anti-Israel position that also becomes an anti-Semitic position. So that's been happening at the universities. That's going to be rolled back, we are told. I think the way to interpret that is in the context of everything else that's going on. So simultaneous with the rolling back of woke, you have the Trump's violent pressure on Israel to sign the recent ceasefire agreement with Hamas. That's not pro-Israel, that's anti-Israel. The ceasefire agreement with Hamas has forced Israel to capitulate. Israel was winning the war, and Trump has now made them lose the war because even the Philadelphia corridor is going to be given back to Hamas. Now, we can talk about what kind of a diagnosis this implies about Israeli leaders, but let's still focus on Trump for a second. If Trump is doing this at the same time that he seems to fight anti-Semitism at home, right? I think the proper interpretation is that he is gaslighting us, right? So he's doing certain things so that you will think that he's the friend of the Jews, right? And convincing you of that requires that he pay a cost. He has to do some actual things that will be dramatic enough to convince the Jews and friends of the Jews like myself that he's actually on our side, right? So he rolls back anti-Semitism at home, does some things that we all applaud, etc. But on the ground, on the strategic ground in the Jewish state, which is the wall that is holding jihadism from flooding the West, right? This is where the fight against world jihad is happening most intensely, is in the state of Israel. And Trump claims to be against jihad, but what does he do? He forces Israel to accept a ceasefire agreement that is precisely the same ceasefire agreement that Biden, the enemy, was insisting that Israel should sign. It's the same agreement. So how is Trump your friend? I think you have to look at all the evidence together. And when you do, what Trump is doing is so dramatically anti-Israel that you have to interpret the other things he's doing as an effort to confuse us, to make us think that he's our friend so that he will trust him when he kicks us in the behind and betrays everything that was needed for the defense of Israel and for the defense of the West.
Well, this point of view is also heard in Israel in quite on the fringe, I must say. But this is a very grave picture that you've drawn here.
Why is it the fringe, though? Yeah, I think it's we say the fringe because
I will
media
explain. I will explain shortly. Donald Trump, if he would run for presidency in Israel and not in the U.S., it would be a landslide that will make the U.S. Landslide be very shy in the corner, because he has somewhere close to I think 75 or 80% support here in Israel. And all of Israel was awaiting eagerly for these elections to rid us of the progressive pro-jihadist regime of the Bidens and the Obamas. And here comes Donald Trump, the new messiah. And this is why large parts of Israeli media and opinion callers are finding it hard to sort out what happened exactly with this hostages deal that Trump imposed on Israel. And I will ask you, since this is the grim picture that you see regarding Donald Trump, what do you think should the Israeli leadership do in this situation?
Well, I mean, obviously, the Israeli leadership should have resisted Trump and not signed that ceasefire agreement, just as it had been resisting Biden. But see, the Israeli bosses, I like to call them the Israeli bosses because they're not really leaders. Leaders of Israel would be defending the Israeli Jews, and that's not what these people are doing. So I'm going to call them the Israeli bosses. These Israeli bosses, they've been facing a lot of pressure from the Israeli public to win the war, because October 7th was just an amazing massacre, and it united Israelis to fight against jihadi terrorism. So there's been a lot of pressure on Netanyahu and his buddies to win the war, and because of that pressure, when it is a matter of resisting Biden, who was represented as an enemy, right? The pressure of the Israeli public, plus the character that Biden embodied, which was enemy of Israel, right, made it so that the equation was, well, the Israeli bosses have to resist Biden. Otherwise, they will lose power in Israel. Everybody will be so offended in Israel that they won't be able to stay in power. However, if in the White House, a friend of Israel takes power, right? A character that embodies a person that embodies the character friend of Israel becomes the president of the United States, then the people running Israel, the Israeli bosses, can cave into him without that producing, impossible offense in the Israeli public. Why? Because if a friend is asking you to sign the ceasefire agreement, then a lot of people think, well, then it must be okay, because Trump wouldn't want us to commit suicide. He's our friend. So if he wants us to sign the agreement, we will do it. That's what makes it possible for this to happen. So long as Biden is president, Netanyahu cannot do this. But once Trump becomes president, he has cover, you see? And the cover is what you mentioned. It's the very high approval rating that Trump has in Israel. That's what allows this maneuvering room to produce the betrayal we just saw.
Dr. Francesco Gil-White, it was a real pleasure, and I think I learned a lot personally. I think also our viewers, and hopefully we will do this again soon. Thank you so much.
It'll be my pleasure. See you soon.
Thank you. And thank you, our viewers at home. Feel free to comment below about the discussion you've just witnessed. Also, you can find under the video player multiple options to support our activity. We are an independent Jewish news channel. Please like and subscribe to our channel. And until next time, bye-bye.
כמה הייתם מוכנים לשלם תמורת ועדת חקירה שאתם סומכים עליה?
מערכת המשפט שלנו
עוסקת בהשלטת כוחותיה על הציבור והשתלטות על הדמוקרטיה.
אנחנו ראינו את השופטים מפגינים, המשתתפים בקפלן, בבייניש, את כל המלצרים האלה, זה פשוט מזעזע. אין.
2024 מהפכה. התקשורת העצמאית, האנטי-ממסדית, משנה סדרי עולם.
You know you're a fake. Your whole network, the way you cover it, is fake. That's why nobody trusts the media anymore.
They are basically just a propaganda tool and activists. They're not anymore journalists, they became activists. Also the tech is working together with the media and there was censorship on Google, on YouTube. Everything was censored.
בדיוק כמו בארצות הברית, התקשורת בישראל מוטה שמאלה עם תקציב עצום של מעל 5 מיליארד שקל בשנה, והיא מנסה לסתום לנו את הפה.
לא יודע אם אתם שמעתם על ערוץ טוב, אבל באמת לעומתו ערוץ 14 זה פילוני.
ערוץ טוב ממשיך להביא את הבשורה, אבל בלעדיכם אי אפשר יהיה לנצח במהפכה הזאת. תנו לנו את הכוח ותמכו בנו כדי שנוכל להמשיך ולייצר עיתונות עצמאית, יהודית ולאומית. לכל אפשרויות התמיכה, ייכנסו לקישור מתחת לנגן.
אנחנו מבינים שבחינם אז אין חינם בעולם. אז כנראה שיצטרך להיות תשלום סמלי מסוים רק בשביל לקבל משהו אמיתי.